thank you for joining us for this episode of Beyond Belief. I'm so excited today to be joined by someone I'm a little bit in awe of, and that is my friend Ganesh, who's with us today. Um, at the moment, where I am sitting in the world, it is the 3rd of July, 2025, and tomorrow is in the United States is Independence Day. Where Ganesh is sitting in New Zealand, it's already the 4th. So Ganesh is already, well, I don't know whether celebrating is the right word when you're in New Zealand, um, but
At the
is
moment, it might be
already into.
commiserating, this epoch of time. My wife's American, so I wished her a happy 4th of July this morning, before she went off to work. Look, it's it's 1776, right? Is independence. So this is now going into the 250th year of America, and at the end of this time next year, of course, this will be a big celebration for Americans that they've been around for 250 years. So it's massive idea, and and the church, effectively has been around for 200 years. So it was born out of that initial first 50 years of, what is America? Can it survive in the world? And, what is its offering? And Mormonism became a all-American religion, an offering that it gave to the world. I don't think all Americans might share that sentiment, but certainly lots of people, in particular Utah, would feel like they have, gone out to the world to proselyte and give of this American essence, because it is the truth. God is American, and if we could just understand that, we would all get along much better. Sorry, say that again, Dan.
Have you seen the Book of Mormon musical?
Mm-hmm.
What you're saying reminds me of the song where he talked about the All-American Prophet. And just listen to what you're saying there. You're reflecting on the fact that next year will be America's 250th birthday, and the church is 200 years old. If we look at that, the church is in the timeline records of America. America was no more than like late child, early teenager in its growth, if you like, when Joseph Smith established the church. So it has been a major part of American life over the years. I think it's interesting when we look at Independence Day. First of all, we've talked about, can I wish any American audience that we have a heartfelt, happy Independence Day? And I mean that sincerely from the bottom of my heart. Okay. These national days and national celebrations are important to all of us. We have different days of celebrations in the UK. We don't have an Independence Day because we've not had to get independence from anyone particularly. But we do celebrate things like Bonfire Night, and we do celebrate Remembrance. In November, we have our national celebrations as well, and they're important to us, and they're important as part of our national cultures. So, in one sense, I'd like to say Happy Independence Day, but also, do I talk about wishing good riddance to the pesky colonials?
That's very generous of you, Dan. As New Zealand shares a very English foundation, and of course we're part of the Commonwealth, so we share King Charles as our monarch, and so it's always slightly with a tinge of jest that we wish America independence celebrations, because of course we think that they were slightly daft in leaving the bosom of the empire.
Absolutely. Or we could argue we kept holding you guys for a lot longer. We live in a different world. The days of colonialism are long past, or should be long past. It's interesting watching certain nations having colonial intent towards countries like Greenland and towards countries like Canada at the moment, and seeing our history repeating itself elsewhere. and think of the lessons that as a nation we may have learned from the mistakes we made being repeated elsewhere. But that's a different story. I have prepared a few slides today. I'm just going to bring those up. I don't want to make this all about slides, though, Ganesh, as much as
Yeah, yeah,
having a
yeah.
good chat, but just
We'll just
really as
chill.
a prompt point to be able to. So,
Oh, I'm frozen on my end here. Oops. I've lost you, Dan.
um,
Oh, there, you're back.
it comes up. Can you hear me, Ganesh?
Yeah, just it's coming through in fits and waves.
Then before tonight, though, I'm watching you scroll really, really fast. I think we're back in the room working properly. Can you
Yep,
hear me okay,
yep,
Ganesh?
yep, back
Yeah.
on.
I will try and put the slides back up again in a second. But they kind of froze the system for a second, so I'm a little bit scared of them.
Well, we probably don't.
The,
We probably don't need slides. I mean, I went through them and
well, let's do that.
you know, I know that part of the book. You know, if we're going to talk about American exceptionalism, I've got one here and you've got one there, and
Absolutely.
and I probably can talk to all the ideas fairly well.
Yeah, no, that's no problem at all. It was only
Yeah.
They were only there to be prompt points anyway. And also, one of the slides did have a nice picture of you with your book, because I felt it'd be appropriate for you to be able to talk about your book. So let's do that. Obviously, some of our audience will be familiar with yourself from the work you've done. Obviously, like I was saying to you before we came on air, I'm really honoured you joined me, knowing how busy you are, talking to and with some of the other post-Mormon space podcasts at the moment. I've seen you recently on with RFM and Bill Real on Mormonism Live. I'm halfway through watching that because I listen to that while I'm working during the day. I've seen you do some really excellent stuff with Rebecca Biblioteca and Landon over on Mormonish and things that you're there. So I'm really grateful for you joining me today. So some of our audience will know you, but some of our audience will be like, "Who's this Ganesh guy anyway? Why has he got someone from New Zealand on?" So can I get you to just give it a bit of context? Talk to me about the book you've written, but particularly in the context of American exceptionalism, which is where we want to think about it.
Well, like you, Dan, you know, I'm away from the center of the church, but of course, it's a massive part of my identity as being a Mormon, and I even married an American, so I go back and forth to the States quite a bit, and my children are American as well as Kiwi, so I'm really interested in America, I'm really interested in the church, and I'm really interested in how this part of the world, meaning the States, has influenced my part of the world, but also across the globe. So one of the kind of cool topics, and it's especially timely for today because of Independence Day, is that idea of American exceptionalism, and just the understanding that when a nation forms, and it's going to form because it's a break off of something else, right? How do they define themselves? How do they make sure that they've got enough cohesion that they can, operate? What are the stories that they're going to invest in that are going to mean that they're going to have enough in common so that they stick together and don't fracture anymore, right? Because you could potentially, of course, have one fracture and then another fracture, just depending on the groups that are available, and we see that across all the world. And so America's grappled with those kinds of things really early on in their career. They divorced their relationship with Britain during the Revolutionary War and declared independence, of course, and this became a rally cry that, we want to do it alone. We don't want to be overseen. We are, mature enough to do so. But at the time, it was an experiment. They, certainly no British colony had done this yet. And so the idea that people would be able to take and rule themselves was a novel and an untried experiment. So they had a few hiccups as they tried to think about this, because one of the things that kept countries together prior to this was the idea of the divine right of kings, that for some reason, divinity meant that monarchs were invested with this great power to rule. And of course, the King James version of the Bible was done by King James, it does have some things in there that are about his agenda, and his agenda is to consolidate power, to make sure that people follow him. And the monarch in Britain is also the head of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. So divine right of kings was a really big deal, and nations rallied around some kind of strong man or woman who could therefore be their figurehead. And this was just how it was organized, till America decided that they didn't want to do that and tried alone. But not everybody felt that way. There were lots of king men in America, people who still believed in a king. In fact, they even petitioned I think it was Alexander, the Prussian king, to come and be America's king.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite interesting when you talk about that divine right to rule and things like that. I mean, nominally, that's still the case with our monarchy in the UK. I mean, for all practical intents and purposes, the UK is a very secular country now, and we don't sit here in the UK talking about divine right of kings. But King Charles is king of is head of the Church of England. He held the title Defender of the Faith, or Defender of Faith, as he adapted it to. And that divine right to rule, being ordained by God to be king, still actually is theoretically part of what makes King Charles king even today. Um, and we do have separation of church and state fairly much, but the Church of England still has significant influence within the UK structure, within Parliament, with the House of Lords, and normally even my daughter's school is a Church of England school, with a Christian ethos that runs through that. But we're not here to talk about UK here. We want to think about the United States. My other thought, though, was we talk about American exceptionalism. I think we got to concede that if we were to go back to 1776 in the UK, the idea of British exceptionalism probably would have been very, very strong, as Britain at the time was the preeminent, was aspiring to be becoming the preeminent world power at that time. And I think that is a backdrop that we need to recognise as well.
Yeah, and it's a very important backdrop because, of course, the colonial powers that were fighting against each other at the time, right? Spain and France were fighting against Britain. They had both, France and Spain had and England had claim in the Americas as well, right? So these are really big deals. That just before the Revolutionary War was the French and Indian War, of course, was when the British were fighting the French in America. So this, and part of the whole, a big part of the expansion of the United States later was the Louisiana Purchase, which was basically Britain taking over the French claim, which after the defeat of Napoleon. So that's a really big deal. Florida was Spanish, so taking over the Spanish claim in continental United States was a big deal. Of course, Spain, retained a stake with Mexico down, and England retained a stake, and slightly French by Canada up. So these are we feel like this is just the way it's always been, because it's always been that way in our lifetimes. But when Joseph was alive, it was just a generation that there wasn't a United States, and when he was born, there was still parts of the present day United States that were parts of other countries' claim. So, this is a really big deal. Just we are so removed from it, we don't even think about it.
It's interesting when you look at the church history, and I've been looking a lot at the history of the church recently in terms of particularly Nauvoo era and around the martyrdom and those kind of things. And I think it's easy to forget that Nauvoo, 1844, was the American frontier. All right. And I would suggest that the martyrdom was actually some rough frontier justice being meted out against the guy who had really, really upset the locals with First Amendment rights breaches, with polygamy, with trying to set up his own kingdom inside the United States, if you like, and various other things that were at least perceived by the people around it. And then we see Wild West frontier justice coming into Carthage. And I think it's easy to forget that is actually the backdrop that's going on in that part of the story.
Yeah, and I mean, there's whole books about this, and Ben Park's one is probably the best. That tension of, one of the things that America prided itself with was that as it created states, that it was creating civilization, right? And by civilization, I mean, a rule of law. There's a governor. There is court systems. There are, kind of a system of and a mechanism of reliability. Land deeds, all of those kinds of things that you expect in a civilized society. Courts, lawyers, judges, police, but the idea that you couldn't just take a gun and shoot your neighbor, or while yes, it was the frontier because it was right on the edge of the United States at the time, it also prided itself with the idea that it was civilized. It's so civilized. And actually, Joseph Smith used that. He abused that, really, because there were systems of law that were supposed to be followed, and particularly Joseph loved the idea of habeas corpus, and that he could. This meant that habeas corpus is a legal writ that basically says you can't just be detained for no good reason. It needs to be established that the person who is trying to detain you has the authority to do so. And Joseph Smith, utilized that question in the law to basically rule that nobody had the right to detain him, but he had the right to detain other people. So yes, it's the frontier, and these people are, but they have all come from other parts of the United States that have had the rule of law, and they are enacting it in this new state of Illinois, Missouri, and even Iowa. Well, Iowa's a territory at the time, but it's soon to become a state. They're expecting a rule of law, and Joseph. It's not that Joseph is he's flouting the law, and so then they feel like they have no choice but just to take him out. They don't want to choose that because they want it to be civilized, and that's why it's deteriorated so far so fast. Because this has been going on for years by the point that Joseph gets incarcerated in Carthage. That he's been arrested several times and he's got himself off, and so this last time when he's stuck in Carthage jail, the vigilantes, who are prominent people in the community, they're not thugs, they are business people, they are magistrates, they are they're just normal citizens who care, but they believe that Joseph is going to get off, and so instead of, and they just don't believe that that's right, so they take the law into their own hands. But those people are law-abiding citizens. They go on to be senators, they go on to be mayors, they go on to be, some of them are newspaper people at the time. They're not thugs. This is not the Wild West, as much as we like to kind of portray it as that, because that makes it a good story, right? These are thugs taking out Joseph. That's not what's happening. These are civilized people frustrated that the law is being circumvented by Joseph, and they feel like they have no other option than to kill him. So and that actually speaks to American exceptionalism too, because part of what makes American exceptional to European settlers is that it is civilized. It does have laws. There isn't this, there is the Wild West, and Utah becomes part of that Wild West, right? Where frontier justice happens at the end of a shotgun. But this part of the United States, as you are making a state, the whole reason to do so is to give people the assurance that there's civil rights in place, constitutions that guard your safety. There is a right of appeal. You won't get detained. You won't get shot on your front doorstep for no good reason. That there's a way to bring people to justice if they've committed a crime. This is civilization, and this is what makes America exceptional. This is, you can be safe here. So people who are in Britain, who are having a terrible time in the Industrial Revolution and are poor and disenfranchised, they're being sold a story which is, come to America, we have civilization, but it favors everybody, not just these class systems that are in Liverpool that mean that some guy is some lord is lording it over you, and you're a peasant.
Victorian England, which is the period of decay, if you like, was brutal. It was very brutal in a lot of different ways. It was very for the rich, it was very for the wealthy. We were leading the world in industrialization, but that was based around the rich. So if you were poor, you really suffered, and people lived in atrocious conditions and atrocious housing with high levels of crime, high levels of malnourishment. And it was I would think that Victorian England, in many cases, if you were not wealthy, was not a fun place to be. Was not a fun place to be. What I want to do, Ganesh, I've got a question for you, okay? Because obviously we've talked around the subject, but very quickly, can I get you just to define for me what we mean by American exceptionalism and how that ties into the church?
So American exceptionalism is the idea that America is exceptional. It's divinely decreed, that God is in charge, that it's God's promised land, and the Book of Mormon makes that case. This is a promised land that Lehi and his family have gone to America, and it's been set aside and chosen to be the place where the righteous will get refuge. That is the exceptional nature of the Americas, and pretty much it's really only the United States. When we, even though we say American exceptionalism, we're not talking about Canada because it has a king, and and we're not talking about Mexico, because it also has a king, but it's also Catholic, right? And American exceptionalism is for Protestant, freedom fighters. So this is what the exceptionalism that you find for the white settlers in the Book of Mormon, that it's their now divine inheritance. That is what Joseph and the people around him felt, and that's what got written into the Book of Mormon. Because, of course, the previous inhabitants, who were those brown and savages, dirty, unindustrious savages, they had fallen from grace, from God, and now these white Gentiles who had come from Europe have been divinely decreed to be the new inheritors of this promised land.
Now, in the your early chapters, one of your themes that you approach is about American exceptionalism. Um, I've really enjoyed reading that. As I was talking to you before, I've not had a chance to read all of the book yet by any stretch, purely because I've got a major project on professionally that I've got to do first, and it's caused me a bit of a dilemma. I'm forcing myself to put this book down. If anyone is after a good read, and you've read other books about Joseph Smith, I'm only in the early chapters, so please don't quote me too much. Ganesh's book, you take what we call a thematic approach, and rather than saying this is Joseph as a baby as he grows up and talking through his life, you pick on different themes that are going on in the background of Joseph's life and Joseph's worldview, and contextualize Joseph and himself and the church along different themes. And one of the first themes you pick up is American exceptionalism. Okay, which like I said, I absolutely loved. I found it a really refreshing way to approach and understand Joseph and the church in those early days. But in that chapter, you talk a bit about let me phrase the question a different way. We've talked about American exceptionalism in a church context, but is this idea of American exceptionalism, is it just a Mormon thing, or would you say it's a wider thing in the United States in that time period?
Oh, it's absolutely the new United States story, right? I mean, they're breaking up from Europe, from Britain. So why are they doing that? Well, they're doing that because, they don't want to be under rule, but they're telling the story that, kings are corrupt. Kings tax you and put burdens on you. They're saying that kings are, sexually deviant, because they're the royal family in Britain is the soap opera of its day. King Henry VIII's conquests are, sexual conquests are the fodder for, a whole lot of scandal, right? So these are all evidences that kings are evil, and God is going to raise up a righteous nation apart from this wickedness, and that was prevalent. A couple of themes about that end up in the Book of Mormon. One is that, of course, that God fought on the side of America, the United States, in its bid against Britain, and that's how they won. Right? So that's American exceptionalism. God's fighting on our side against Britain. Another story is, of course, one of the big things that happens, particularly in Joseph's life, is the War of 1812. Now, it's the Forgotten War, because really the borders don't change after the war. America wins the war, but they just win the right to stay exactly where they are. When Britain defeated France and Napoleon was exiled, the British forces, under King George, turned their armada to the United States. because, one of the reasons why Britain lost the Revolutionary War, was that it was fighting wars on three fronts, right? It was fighting America, it was fighting France, and it was fighting Spain. And so when it defeated Napoleon, it decided, well, okay, we're going to go back and claim America now, because we've got the forces available, and we're still pissed off that they left, right? So the War of 1812 was Britain exerting its influence and trying to take back America. And effectively, there were some horrific things that happened. And Britain sacked Washington, D.C. They burnt the White House. Yeah, this was the terrorist attack of its day, And this is when Joseph is, just a boy. He's 10 at this time, and he's lame from his leg, right? So he's sitting around listening to the paper and other people talking. And of course, this massive event is happening, in his psyche. So, of course, this war went on for a long time, for a few years, 1812 through to 1814. And effectively, it ended in a stalemate, because none of the borders changed, and just basically America got to hold its own, which was a win, because, of course, Britain was expecting that they could go in and take everything back over, but that just did not happen. So, and there were lots of people who were sympathizers to Britain. They wanted a relationship with Britain, and there were king men. There were people who supported they were called the Federalist Party. They supported Britain, supported Britain's claim. They wanted to have a relationship with Britain, and effectively, the war ended that idea. King men, Federalists, they were abolished in the wake of the 1812 ending of the 1812 war, which was a kind of an era called the era of good feelings, from 1815 through to 1820. This was a kind of a new nationalism. Yes, we've won. We are, our right to be a country is secure. We are, exceptional, and God has proved it yet again that we're exceptional. And so this era of good feelings was this huge nationalism that America, the brave, is legitimate. And that's in Joseph's lifetime. That's in his childhood, and he's a patriot already. The Smith family have been in the Americas since 1650, so they've been there a long time, and this was just further confirmation that God was fighting on their side, that America was exceptional, that they were the new inheritors. And of course, one of the things that Britain had done was it had sided with the Native Americans, who were getting upset that America kept encroaching further and further west, and that many Native Americans fought on the side of Britain against the United States, which meant that they had tactical advantage in lots of areas. And so while no one won the war, except that really America just furthered its establishment, the Native Americans lost in the war because they fought on the side of the British, and now there was no difference in change of borders, right? And of course, for the Native Americans, they became the new threat to American sovereignty, which meant that started to work on behalf of displacement. We're going to relocate you to parts outside the United States where you are no longer going to be a threat to the sovereignty of this country. And so we see a Indian removal in 1822. Again, in Joseph's lifetime, Stockbridge tribes were sent to Wisconsin. And then in 1830 was the biggest, the Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson, and then, eastern coast tribes were sent and relocated to interior deserts, like Kansas, and it was called Indian Territory, but it's not great land. And that removed Indians out of the United States and out as a threat to the United States. So all of these things kind of happened together, and they all were a result of this American exceptionalism and America telling the story that they are now the white, righteous inheritors of the land, and American Indians, the native peoples, were the enemy and were displaced.
I think understanding this is really important. So, but what you've been showing is what this American exceptionalism looks like. It's the context. If I were 14 years old, 18 years old, living in upstate New York, this would be the world around me, and it would be the worldview and the environment I live in. Okay, and obviously Joseph's a certain 14 to 18-year-old young man, depending where in the story we set, um, in upstate New York. How do you think that this worldview that he has around American exceptionalism? Well, in your book, you show really well how that, first of all, is in the Book of Mormon, then how that comes into the church as the church expands, and then you have some interesting comments about how that evolves as we get towards the end of Joseph's life. Talk to me about that. How the church, how this American exceptionalism weaves itself through the early history of the church.
So, of course, the Book of Mormon confirms the same ways that the white settlers feel about America. So that was great, and the early church did too, right? Joseph believed that the church was exceptional. He believed that the teachings of the Book of Mormon could be exceptional to people, and people gathered on the idea that the Book of Mormon gave them some sense of exceptionalism and made them special. And of course, being special makes you entitled to inheritance, entitled to land, entitled to live, entitled to take over. And that's what they did. They took over places. And of course, there were often people already there. In Missouri, when they went to Jackson County, there were locals there. It had newly become a state. They were making their way in the world. And these Mormons came in and said, we've been told this is the promised land. We are its rightful inheritors. You guys are going to get kicked out because the Lord said that all the wicked people are going to be destroyed. And of course, the locals were like, you're crazy and get out of here. And so this became a cycle of, Mormons going into an area, telling the people who were already there that they were exceptional, and this was God's promise to them for this land. And of course, this caused conflict. It turned into violence, and eventually they would get kicked out. So you get kicked out of Jackson County, Missouri. They get kicked out of Missouri proper in Jackson County in 1833, Missouri proper in 1838, and they end up in Nauvoo. The people of Illinois effectively feel sad for them.
Before we move on to talk about Nauvoo, because I know the narrative changes as we arrive on Nauvoo, I've just got a couple of thoughts about the little bits you were there. One of the things that you highlight really well in your writing is how this church builds on the idea of American exceptionalism. So, for instance, we see that the Garden of Eden is in Missouri. We see that that Christ will return and meet with Adam, the Ancient of Days, at Adam-on-Diarmid, which is why it's called Adam-on-Diarmid. We see these claims of the first parts of the world's history taking place in the American. Does that count as the Midwest? I'm not an expert on American geography, but taking part in the heart of America. And the other thing, so there's that side of exception. The other side of it as well, and it caused me to reflect, is there's a lot of debate at the moment about where the Book of Mormon actually occurred. because no one can find any archaeological evidence. Is it a local model? Is it upstate New York? Is it in South America? Where did it happen? And one of the things that I think you demonstrate really well is Joseph in the Book of Mormon has enough there to define where the promised land is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well,
Can you talk to me about
what you're
that?
talking about is right. You know, Joseph designates Jackson County as the New Jerusalem. So this is God's
Right.
special place, and as God's special people, we should be there. And of course, when they get kicked out of Jackson County, and now they're in Caldwell County, he gets a new revelation that Adamine Diamond is in Davis County next door, and and of course it's God's special place, and they're God's special people, so they should inherit this space. So Joseph keeps defining parts of America as really special. So so he's one-upping the United States. The United States citizens already believe that they're special because this is a special promised land of God. And then Joseph is going, oh, and within this promised land of God, there are these even more special places where the saints are supposed to gather. And of course they gather, they tell their neighbors that this is a special place which has been designated for them, and that they have their neighbor, the people who are already there have to leave, or they're not wanted and they're wicked and they'll be destroyed. And of course this leads to conflict, and expulsion, and this just goes around and around in a circle till they get kicked out of Missouri and make their way to and make a city in Nauvoo.
Yes, absolutely. Would you say, and I'm really interested to know what your thoughts on this are, that obviously Joseph, in his early 20s, as he establishes the church, is all in on this American exceptionalism. He uses this as one of his big vehicles for the church moving forwards. It's a story that's great for people joining the church. It obviously is part of his worldview and his belief anyway, that America is. And by putting Garden of Eden, Adamon Diamond, and these places in, it really doubles down on the not just American exceptionalism, but overlays LDS Mormon exceptionalism, ties the two together really, really strongly. I think that is possibly one of the biggest things that upset the Missourians.
Yeah.
Not just that. I mean, the fact that people turned up, started building farms, and telling them that they were all apostate and heathens probably didn't work either. But it would have had a massive part on why they weren't very popular in Missouri, and almost destroyed the church.
Yeah.
As a result. What's your thoughts?
Oh yeah, look, that's exactly what happened. Look, Joseph is poor. He's really poor. He's really interested in some kind of inheritance. That word comes up a lot in the Book of Mormon, because he has nothing, and he feels like he should have something because he's special, but he has nothing. And the people that warm to the Book of Mormon also feel the same way. Joseph tapped into that same feeling of his own that other people resounded with, which was that why are these poor, incredibly righteous Christians not getting their promised land? And so, the Book of Mormon suggested
politics.
Yeah. And so it was incredible. If you were poor and you read the Book of Mormon, and this still is a case today, right? You read the Book of Mormon, and it tells you the poor, the humble, you are the ones that are supposed to be the righteous, and you're going to be blessed, soon. So, and so you gather on that basis because, gosh, if you're, and this, of course, becomes a really big thing when the church sends missionaries to England, because the people in the Industrial Revolution are feeling horrific, and they're reading the Book of Mormon about this land of milk and honey where Jesus is going to come down and create a new Jerusalem for so that everybody can feel and have what they need. That's an incredible promise, and they leave their homes and they travel across the sea to be part of this incredible safety that they are not feeling in Liverpool, in various industrial towns in the UK, which are just horrific to live in.
Yeah.
And they're coming. So the American, the idea that there's American exceptionalism, and that there's now this LDS, this church exceptionalism with a prophet. He's got a prophet. God is in the world today with a prophet telling you how you're going to be able to have this inheritance and relieve yourself of your poverty and your safety. They came in droves. English immigrants into the church was a massive part of the church.
Yeah. I think two of the people that have been able to demonstrate this really, really well are Matt Parker and Trey Stone of South Park / Book of Mormon, the musical.
Right.
And obviously that great masterpiece film, Team America, World Police. I'm not going to sing the songs from Team America, but if you're familiar with it really, really focuses on the idea of we're America, we're better than everybody else. And highlights that so well. If you watch the Book of Mormon musical, one of the songs is sung, and I can't remember the female character's name. She sings this song about Salta Lake Cite and how now that they've got the gospel and they've learned about Jesus and they're following Jesus, she's hoping that Elder Cunningham will take her to Salta Lake Cite, where she can be with the Mormons and be with God. And it's overlaid in Africa in a pseudo-modern setting. But what you're describing, the early Mormons, converts that are coming from these islands where I live, because they were living in Liverpool and Manchester and Bradford and Leeds, and these are all cities I've been to. Bradford, fantastically interesting place, beautiful architecture, amazing, huge buildings. And you walk around Bradford and you think, 100 years ago, this place would have been amazing. All right, 150 years ago, this place would have been amazing. But it was built on woolen mills. Manchester was built on mills, and a lot of Lancashire was built on mills. Liverpool was built on docks. Sheffield was built on working steel. Each of these cities had them, particularly in the north of England, were built on big industrial, dangerous, ugly work. Us in the south, I'm a southerner. Us in the south, we tend to be more servicey and let it all happen up north. Hence the phrase, "It's grim up north." Um, I can understand when the Mormon missionaries arrive in England and talk about this exceptional place in the United States, which everyone's heard of anyway, and this American exceptionalism is bleeding over. And then they're being told, and of course, it wasn't Salta Lake City then, it was the city of Nauvoo,
Yeah.
or really early days, the city of Kirtland. But we see those same things coming through, and people are coming across the United States as a result. And I think it's really interesting to reflect on how the only issue I have with the Book of Mormon musical is the language is very, very, very strong. But it is a beautifully observed piece of comedy. Beautifully observed piece of comedy that really pokes into some of the characteristics of Mormonism really well. But yeah, they're in Nauvoo, not Nauvoo, they're in Missouri. They've upset the natives, and they've been thrown out, and they end up in Nauvoo. How goes this worldview and American exceptionalism and the way he behaves change now he gets to Nauvoo?
Yeah, so it's a big change, and it's a change that is basically we don't want to be a part of the United States anymore, because they obviously, they've been kicked out of Missouri. They feel like that's unjust and against the principles of the Constitution, and that America has fallen, that America is no longer exceptional, and they make plans to leave. They are looking at other places to go. They're looking at Oregon. They're looking at Texas. They recognize that minority religions are not welcome in the United States, where America has fallen. The United States has fallen, so they make plans to leave Joseph gets killed before he gets to leave the United States. But Brigham Young, takes a number of saints and actively works to leave the United States. By the time he gets to Utah, it is being annexed as a territory. But the whole idea was to leave the United States.
Yes, that was unlucky. He was planning to go to Mexico, which is what Utah was a part of. They wanted to get out of the United States, quite literally. Just before we get into talking about Utah and those kind of things, you mentioned kingmen earlier. The Book of Mormon talks a lot about kingmen and is very opposed to kingmen. By the time we get to the late Nauvoo period, and if I reference the Council of 50, how's that changed?
So they believe that they're setting up a theocracy. They're setting up a kingdom of their own with this little city of Nauvoo, and Joseph is crowned king by the Council of 50. He's set up his political system. Effectively, the Council of 50 is a cabinet. Joseph is running for president. The Council of 50 are his cabinet. They're 50 men that are supporting him in his political endeavors, and he is effectively setting up his own country ruled by God, because it's a caliphate, it's a theocracy, and he is crowning himself king in that and he's looking to remove himself from the United States. So all of the things that the Book of Mormon talk about in terrible terms about other people, Joseph is now doing in Nauvoo. It's just wild. It's wild, but it's amazing.
Absolutely. One of the things that I picked up, like listening to another of your appearances recently, this morning I was listening to, and obviously I was aware that Joseph had been ordained king by the Council of 50. I wasn't aware that he wasn't the only leader of the church to be ordained king.
I know. It's fascinating, isn't it, to think that Brigham Young was ordained king, John Taylor. This was meant to continue. Of course, by 1890, because polygamy was a big issue, of course, and the church had to decide what it was going to do. It was looking for other options. It set up a colony in Mexico, right? Colonial Juarez. And it had set up a colony in Canada in a place called Bountiful in Alberta. It also looked at the opportunity to come to New Zealand. There were reports that the Mormons were going to come to New Zealand, and it also looked at the opportunity to go to Russia, which was at that time Alaska. So it was in 1890. It was looking to decide to leave the United States again, or leave it properly this time, because the last attempt got thwarted. And of course, the church decided to stay put, to acquiesce to the United States, to get its own statehood and comply with dismantling polygamy. But if other people had their way, and history had turned out a different way, then the church might have had its headquarters in Mexico or Canada or Alaska or New Zealand. It's it's so fascinating to think of how crazy that is.
It is. And what I find interesting is I spend a lot of time lurking on Twitter, okay, and see a lot of the posts that are in that community, and there is a strong presence from the Desnat side of the church on that X space. And one of the things that I find so fascinating is, I'm going to use a Britishism here, but the jingoistic exceptionalism of state patriotism and to coincide with Mormonism that I see from members of the church. And patriotism in the church today is a massive part. One of the interesting debates I saw raging on Twitter was about, should we be singing the national anthem in church? Not on a special occasion, but should we just be singing this national anthem as one of our sacrament hymns? And I'm like, it's in the hymn book. Text was in there, but why would you? All right. In a worship ceremony where we're worshipping our God, why would you? But there was a genuine debate raging about whether we should be singing the Star Spangled Banner in church on a regular basis, and a strong defense of that. American exceptionalism within the church and patriotism is alive and well. And I think it's really interesting when you look at that late Nauvoo period and the early Utah period, where the behavior of Joseph, Brigham, John Taylor could, if you looked at it a certain way, could be considered treasonous.
Oh, it was definitely treasonous, and it was treasonous at the time. I mean, Joseph was in Carthage jail, accused of treason. Like, and
Yeah,
he'd already
that's
been
what kept
in
him there.
Missouri, Liberty Jail, accused of treason. This is treasonous. It absolutely is. And of course, because the church in the late 19th century decided to line itself with the United States and fall in line. We don't tell that part of the history because, of course, it's embarrassing. We don't say that Joseph was treasonous. We don't say that the church was actively working to leave the United States, because, of course, that undermines our current position. But that's absolutely what was happening at the time. Funny story about your hymns. I mean, I'm active, right? So every time. Like, we have New Zealand hymn, New Zealand anthem, which gets sung in our church on occasion. But when it comes to King's birthday, I always say, "Why aren't we singing? The God Save the King." It's in our hymn book. And then of course, it's July 4th today, and this weekend, why aren't we singing? The Star
So
Spangled Banner.
beautiful.
That's
Yeah.
also in the hymn book. So it's just a really interesting dynamic that at some level we see nationalism as spiritual, as divine, as important to connect to our religious observance, through the singing of national anthems as hymns. They are hymns in our hymn book. And yet, at the same
Absolutely.
time, the case that you're making is that there's a part of the church which is treasonous. Joseph was treasonous. This Nauvoo was a treasonous act. Utah, leaving the United States to go to Utah was a treasonous act. Being crowned king, treasonous act. And this is the
Sacred
beginning.
oaths to take vengeance on the United States is a
Yes, yeah,
treasonous
oath of
act.
completely treasonous. That didn't come out of the temple ceremony till 1913 or something crazy like that.
Yeah.
So the basis of Nauvoo and how it went through into the Utah branch of the church is based on treason. But of course, because it's in the Book of Mormon as being American exceptionalism and divine right of the promised land. Of course, we've jettisoned the whole treasonous aspect of Nauvoo, and now we return to the Book of Mormon understanding of promised land, because that's the current reality we live in, and we just don't talk about the time that we were treasonist.
Presence of church, and I say more recent because I'm going to go back as far as Benson. Okay, obviously Benson served in the United States government. He was very on the extreme right of politics within the United States, and he has many quotes, and I'm not going to go digging through them now, but we can find many quotes from Benson talking about the Constitution being divine and inspired, and echoing Joseph's early claims of that. We can find many quotes from Benson, basically about fighting evil communists and preserving the United States. We see blatant racism, frankly, from him as well, coming through, and we see the church doubling down on that American exceptionalism, in particularly in that Benson era. And building up to that, because obviously he was one of the leaders of the church for many years before he became president of the church. So it wasn't new that he suddenly appeared as prophet and started talking about that, but it was part of his life. If we look at Elder Oaks now, who will be, I will be surprised if he's not president of the church by the end of this year. And that's no slight on President Nelson. He's just very, 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 very old. And I think he's living on borrowed time. When you're 100, maybe 101, anyone is. So President Oaks will become president of the church. If he doesn't become this year, it will be. You know what I mean? And when we look at President Oaks, he has a number of quotes again talking about the divinely inspired Constitution, the position of the United States. And we continue to see this American exceptionalism come through. But here's my question for you. We've talked a lot about the church. We've talked a lot about the church and the historic side of American exceptionalism. Okay. Our audience probably have noted that neither of us Americans, if we're talking about America, and maybe that's a little bit unfair. However, we both grew up in an American church, not in America.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like, being in an American church and not living in America? How was that experience as a child, a youth, as a young adult, perhaps growing up in the church?
Um, well, I guess fortunately for our particular age group, right? America became a superpower in the 1950s, which meant that it had a lot of prominence, particularly in my growing up. When I grew up, there was two channels, right? There was a British channel and an American channel. Because I grew up with all of those British dramas, and it was always a fight in our house. Which channel that the TV would be on. And my parents wanted to listen to the BBC, and I wanted to listen to.
Don't blame them.
Yeah, and I wanted to listen to Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and The Love Boat, and so they, growing up at least in my era, America was incredibly well thought of. Hollywood was the big movie center of the world. Being attached to something American actually was, it was hip and cool, and and in many ways, of course, we had American missionaries that were in our ward. These were, bright, cool-looking guys who were amazing, and I wanted to be just like them. And so, America certainly had a prominence in New Zealand. The fact that the church was American actually was an advantage. It may not be an advantage now. There's a lot, we watch America and they're not the bastion of great things, and lots of people are looking elsewhere for their moral, direction of what's ethical and not, but back in the 80s and 90s, people were looking at America as the policeman of the world, as the depository of democracy and the Enlightenment sweeping across the globe. I don't think that's so much the case now, but certainly growing up, being connected to American was cool. In fact, I can think of one experience where there was a member of the church who was an astronaut and American guy, and he came to our chapel and spoke. I can't remember what his name was.
He came to Crawley as well. He obviously was doing a world tour because he came to the UK
he was
as
doing
well.
a world tour.
We went to Crawley and heard him speak. Yeah.
So some of my friends came to church with me that day to hear the astronaut speak because, America was the head of the space race and America was cool. And, we went to this fireside where we listened to this, former astronaut who was a member of the church bear his testimony that, this was cool in the 80s and 90s,
So, I take your astronaut and go one better. In our local state. So when we talk about the Osmonds, some of the Osmond brothers have now relocated to the UK. Okay, and they live, I believe, over sort of Cheshire way, I believe. But they came and did a fireside
Right.
at our stake center, um, just pre-COVID, just pre-COVID. And it was a lovely evening. They did a fireside, an evening with the Osmond thing. The chapel was absolutely rammed, okay, with members and non-members who had come to hear the Osmonds. I was there. My wife, she was really privileged because she was asked to be the organist and pianist for the night. So she played
Wow.
with some of the Osmonds, which she quite liked, that claim to fame. But
Yeah.
again, the reason I mention that is the Osmonds have had a massive impact. They were asked not to serve missions because they could do more good for the church being the Osmonds and being on stage and those kind of things there. I agree. You know, as I grew up, America was cool. Was cool. It was, whether it be that shop in the middle of Southampton that grew up. I agree with you, Mormon Auditor. He is totally on fire. He is one of the nicest guys I've ever met as well. Um, in case you're wondering what I'm on about, we've just had that come up in the chat there. Ganesh, Ganesh.
Oh, well,
Um,
that Mormon auditor is on fire. He does incredible, presentations.
yes,
Mm.
yes. No, I'll be honest and say he's recently come onto my radar, and I'm working through some of his stuff. Very exciting, interesting stuff that I'm following of your content. So thank you for being with us today. Yeah, you know, when I grew up in the 80s and 90s, you know, they opened a branch of McDonald's in Southampton, and it was a real treat for us to go into Southampton for an evening meal and go to McDonald's and have a cheeseburger or a Big Mac if we were really, really lucky. Um, you know, we
Mm.
had Blockbuster Video, we had American movies. You referenced the Fresh Prince of Bel Air, and you know, my life got flipped turned upside down. And I'd like to, as well. We had four channels, not two. And on a Sunday afternoon, so maybe we shouldn't have been watching it if we were going to be good Mormons. There was a program on our channel four which showed American football, and we used to sit as a family watching the American football highlights. So I got quite into American football as a teenager. My brother more so. I kind of followed with that, but I had a love for San Francisco 49ers because they were
Right.
winning everything back in those days. Um, you know, so Americanisms were a major part of impact on what we're doing, and in the church as well. You know, and it had a major part of that.
Well, I'm
I,
married. I married an American, so I got my own piece of America.
yeah, absolutely. Um, you know, it was so much of it was a wonderful thing. I remember being in Sunday school lessons and seminary lessons, particularly talking about some of those American exceptionalism points that we talked about today, and learning about America being this divine place that was assigned by God, that is the only place the Book of Mormon could have come forth, and all those kind of teachings. Then I don't hear those things being talked about in the church very much anymore. But it was very much part of that Benson era curricular learning and the way that we talked about these kind of things. And so it was there in the background. I think for me, one of the things the church wasn't so good at was being a global church. All right.
Right.
And what do I mean by that is the programs of the church, and I think potentially were written for Utah.
Yeah.
You know, when you've got a ward of with so many young men that you only get a chance to pass the sacrament once a month, you know, um, when you've got a ward with so many young women, the programs work. Whereas in the UK, we find ourselves trying to make American programs work without context of what they were talking about. So much of the content we received was Americanized and
Yeah.
was really hard. I don't know. Let me just give you a really practical example. As a youth, I was taught very strongly, you know, that in terms of relationships with the girls, you group date at 14, yeah, you could single date at 16, all right, and no heavy petting, all right. Now,
Broke all those
as a
rules.
UK person, okay, the whole dating structure in the UK is very different to in America, I'm assuming, because even today, yeah, I get the idea of going out with a group of friends. But in the UK context, what the heck is a group date? You know?
Well,
And
I didn't even know
what
what
is
petting
petting?
was.
What is this I'm not allowed to do? What?
What is that word? Necking and petting? What the heck is that? Oh,
I am
that's
almost
passion,
50 years old.
passion and feeling up. Oh, that was what our
Right, okay, I'm with you now. I only know that because I watched Neighbours. You know, um, um, but we were so curricularized from the States that we would have our leaders talk to us about not no heavy petting. And I'm 50 years old, and yeah, I sort of know what it is, but no one's ever given me a good definition of what heavy petting is. Yeah, stroking the cat. God, you know. And again, I'm talking my
yeah.
experience
I-
here. I can't speak for every other member of the
Oh,
church in
very
or any other
similar.
nation around the world.
Yeah, very similar in New Zealand. In fact, we were told that the church culture was the only culture. That everything else should be subordinate to that.
Yes.
And of course,
Yeah.
in New Zealand, there's a lot of Maori and Pacific Islanders. So effectively, they were told that their culture, the places that they were from, the kind of history that was a part of their makeup, that was less important. So English was the language to have the gospel in. If you had to make a choice between going to a cultural activity or going to church meeting, leadership training, you should go to leadership training because that's the culture of God. Really, we're just talking about the culture of Utah. And so, of course, there were lots of things that I didn't participate in because my culture was Utah, the
Yeah.
church, and that took precedent over anything else because if you were living the gospel properly in New Zealand, which I'm sure is similar in the UK, you would defer to the church as your first culture and disenfranchise your connections outside. I mean, there were missionary opportunities maybe, but they weren't something that you would engage in as your core identity.
I think to be fair, I agree with what you're saying. I think if we're going to be fair, partly that is true, but partly the 80s, 90s church, certainly here in the UK, was a lot more involved than it is today. And I mean that not just in terms of 3 hour block and a lot more meetings, things like that. Um, but as a youth, we had a youth activity, a stake youth activity every single month. It was called Mad Saturday. And we'd
Yeah.
get together as a stake all Saturday and we'd have a church dance at the end of the day. I went to a golden green ball. I still don't know why it's called a golden green ball or why
Because
the
it's
rose
American.
prom is the rose prom. Yeah, okay. All right. But we did have a gold and green ball and a rose
We had them
prom
too.
every year. And we had a speech festival. We had road shows. We had um, all these different things, all these different events coming through. Now, I'm assuming when I listen to John DeLynn and the guys in America podcasting, and they talk about church sports, and my wife spent some time in America, and she talks about how the fact that their young women had a softball team, and this church sports is a real thing between the different wards there. 'Cause you can put a team out just in your ward. But we would have a sports day, and I was in this tiny little branch called Hive, and the six of us that actually were active at church who were capable of running turned up, ran every single event, half killed ourselves, and lost to Poole because or Bournemouth because they had loads and loads of people we could go and race, you know.
Mm.
But we did all these things very Americanized in terms of their structure. So the language we used was very Americanized. You talked about Maori and Maoris, and I'm not from New Zealand. I'm not an expert on that. I'm not going to pretend to be. I don't want to offend, insult. We do have a very good friend who has lived here in the UK for a long time. Has actually moved back to Australia, but is Maori. Okay. And she's moved back to your side of the world, although she's in Australia.
Yeah,
Um,
pretty.
but of course, my understanding is those are an important part of Maori culture.
I can't quite see them. Can you pull it closer to the screen there?
I mean, it's not Maori, but I've done the
Ah,
Mormon thing of getting a tattoo.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
it's Yeah.
Is it,
Okay.
is that sort of this? It looks like you've got a Southern Cross, and it looks like you've got a kind of a, some almost like frangipani, which is a very island flower.
I'm not going to go too much into the significance of it because it
Okay,
relates to my wife,
right.
and I'm trying to keep in terms of names and things like that. And I would, but
Yeah,
yeah,
sure.
it's reminiscent and has a reminiscence there. But of course, if we look at Pacific Island and Maori culture, tattoo is an important part of that culture,
Yeah, yeah,
is my understanding. But if I pull out the French and the youth pamphlet, until the last iteration, it just frankly said, tattoos you don't do.
yeah. And
How would
that's
that
a really
sit?
good example of how, if you participated in those things like tattoos for cultural reasons, it was seen that you were choosing your culture over the church, and that was really, frowned upon.
Yeah.
Mm.
Um,
Um, uh, uh, Dan, I need to go because I've got
no,
to
no,
try
that's
and
fair enough. But
I've got to go to
we're
go
over
to work.
time.
It's it's night for you, but it's morning for me, and I've made some
I
commitments. I need
do
to.
I do apologize, Gareth.
No,
We've
no,
been
that's fine.
chatting so
I,
well. I've
I
lost
can,
track of the time.
yes, and I can talk forever because I find these things so fascinating, and the kind of,
Yeah.
the UK experience and the New Zealand experience, I think, has lots of similarities. Just being outside of that, um, Utah and particularly American bubble of how the church operates, I think is it's fascinating to me, and I'm really interested in the things that we share as a culture, even though we grow up on opposite sides of the world, because of our connection to the church and its American influence in our lives. That's mind-boggling to me that we can have so much in common. So on that particular front, let alone other fronts. So and it's all about that American exceptionalism that became part of the church and how it spread that in a missionary way throughout the world, including the UK and including New Zealand and Australia and the Pacific Islands. Yeah.
If you want to, not you, I'm talking to the audience here. If you want to understand more about how this American exceptionalism works and overlays in the church, and frankly, if you want to understand a lot about how other concepts overlay and interweave through the church with Joseph and the on, I recommend a good book. It's called Joseph Smith. The
Is it this one?
Well, again, this is waving it there. Go with Joseph Smith, the Architect of Mormonism, a topical biography. It is a fantastic book, and like I said, what is beautiful about this book is it looks at many of these themes as themes rather than just a straight biography of Joseph's life. It's fascinating. It's a great read. I can tell you for free, it is available through all good reputable Amazons because they delivered it to my door. It is also available on Amazon Kindle. And if you happen to subscribe to Kindle Unlimited, it is available through Kindle Unlimited as part of your Kindle Unlimited subscription because I now have it on my Kindle as that, as well as having um, bought a copy of the book. It is a great read. And if you enjoy reading stuff about Joseph, if you've read No Man, if you've read Rushstone Rolling and some of the other books out there, I would recommend this book because it gives a very different way of looking at Joseph's life. Um, Apparently, Latter Day Digest is waiting patiently for you, Ganesh. So I'm going to wrap up there. Um,
I,
Thank you
I,
very
I
much for joining me today.
I did a podcast with them yesterday, which that they'll probably release today or next day or something like that. But there's lots there. And I suppose if you're liking the kind of stuff that you're hearing, I'm doing a lot of podcasts at the moment, so you can go check out other ones, and we'll be talking about slightly different aspects, but hopefully they really paint a really interesting picture that early America and the things that were happening in Joseph's environment really impacted what we currently
Yeah,
kind of inherited because of Joseph's legacy. And that's the point I make in the book, that everything,
yeah,
Joseph is Mormonism and Mormonism is Joseph. So if you really want to understand kind of the skeleton of what's happening, that all of these things are built on, including gold and green balls, and and stake athletic stays. That's all built on the framework and skeleton that was Joseph's life in early America, and how that just positioned the whole of what we have. So yeah, hopefully very explanatory.
So you need to be elsewhere. But thank you very much for joining us. It's been a wonderful evening. Hopefully, we'll be able to get together again at some point soon. I think it could be good to explore some of the other chapters in your book together,
Yeah,
and have a delve into some of those if you're up for it. But in the
happy to.
meantime, thanks for being with us tonight. If you're following this, my next scheduled broadcast is next Wednesday. If you're following the series I'm doing, my daughter at the moment, she grew up outside of the church, peripheral to the church, and is basically asking me the tough questions. She's coming on, and we're sitting together, and she's asking me the questions she's always wanted to ask about the church. And if there are people in the audience here who would love to come and join us for that, it'd be great to see you there. In the meantime, it's been a wonderful evening, Rob. My name's Beyond Belief. Thank you so much for joining us, Ganesh, and I will see you next week.